head of the Institute for the Study of Europe here at Columbia University, which, as you know from the program, is involved in the organizing of this, I think, very interesting conference, together with the Center for East Central European Studies here at Columbia University, but also with the Kosciuszko Foundation and the Semper Polonia Foundation. And I would like to welcome all of you most cordially to this conference, especially, of course, the participants who've come from afar and I hope who are no longer too jet-lagged. I think we have a wonderful day, which, of course, on the one hand, is perhaps a good omen for the discussions of this conference, and perhaps at the end we may be able to drop the question mark at the end of our conference title. But it's, of course, also the temptation to slip away and to enjoy New York. But tomorrow and Sunday is also supposed to be like this, so I hope you can still enjoy the city. Now, I want to do two things. First of all, make a very few general remarks about the design of this conference, and then secondly, introduce John Mitskill, if he still needs introduction, the chair of this particular panel, who will then introduce the panelists individually. Now, I think we had two excellent keynote speeches yesterday, and as far as I remember, they really already raised all the major questions that we want to discuss today and that were behind the planning of this particular conference. First of all, of course, and we are both historians, history and memory, the burdens of the past. Then I think yesterday the question of the neighbors of these two countries we will be talking about today, especially towards the east, were raised, and the whole security question that I think will be part of the second panel also this morning. And then I thought it was particularly interesting how the two speakers began to talk about this asymmetrical relationship that both countries, of course, are having their gaze towards the West, but the Germans looking west then find that the Poles also looking west are looking at the back of the Germans, when in fact both of them are looking across the Atlantic, and the role of the United States in this picture. So I thought that then raised the interesting question of the role of NATO in this whole arrangement, and of course, and that's one of the final sessions also, the role of the European Union. And Dr. Heimsöth yesterday said, I think, ended on an optimistic note actually, and felt that he at least was looking into the future, which is our last panel, with considerable hope. Now, all these problems have been discussed, and that brings me to my second point, here in this building for many, many years, and I would like to stress here the key role that John Mitskill has in this, not only in organizing this conference, and I think you know how complicated it is to the logistics of all this, but also in the discussion of the problems of today's conference. As you probably know, his family background is in Poland. He has kept in touch with Poland, is frequently over there, and in a very curious way, because I came to all this relatively recently, I think we have been very close colleagues, perhaps I may say also friends, because whenever we meet, we've discussed these problems. I was born in Berlin, so I think there were a lot of things that we had in common, but given that we are both historians, also could always look back into periods of the German-Polish relationship which were less fortunate than they are perhaps today. So I'm really delighted that when we discussed all these things, that he then said, well, let us have a conference on this topic. And then, of course, we were further lucky, I think, John, because Zdzisław Krasnodębski came here as our Polish visiting professor last fall. And he is, of course, the most interesting person in this picture, because as you probably know, he comes from Poland, but he has a professorship at Bremen University. And he therefore has also been the driving force behind the organization of this conference. So it was a very happy constellation that we had here at Columbia, And that is how the idea of this conference was conceived, and I really look forward to what I'm sure will be very fruitful and constructive discussions on neutral territory, because I'm hoping also that the fact that we are gazing east from here will actually also raise not only many important problems, but also point up some of the solutions that we are all wrestling with and hope to find, of course, for the future. So thank you again for coming, and we look forward to a very constructive and fruitful conference. Thank you. John?
Thank you, Volker. I too would like to thank Zdzisław Krasnodębski, because if it weren't for him and the lectures that he gave at Columbia this year, the brief remarks that I made yesterday at the Kościuszko Foundation would not have been made. Zdzisław has, as you all know, a very wide network of friends and colleagues in both countries. And in fact, most of this conference was due to the fact that he used that network to bring the best possible people here, of course in consultation with the Consul General, in consultation with the Polish ambassador, Mr. Reiter, in Washington, and in consultation with the Consul General of Poland as well. The result is that our first panel today brings us several people who are probably well known to you if you're interested in the topic. The first speaker, and let me just mention them all in order, is Łukasz Kamiński. Dr. Kamiński is a graduate of the University of Wrocław, has a number of books to his credit, and now has been working for some time actually, in the Institute for National Remembrance in Warsaw, where he's the Deputy Director of the Public Education Program, which has a huge role to play in Poland today. And it was thanks to him, basically, that last fall we had a very important exhibit here from the Institute on the so-called Poznań Czerwiec, the June events in Poznań in 1956. One of the rather unfortunately large number of historical occurrences in Central Europe that Americans are so poorly informed about. That's why we have conferences like this. Our second speaker is Professor Milowid Kuniński, who's a philosopher from the Jagiellonian University in Poland and a specialist on Hayek. Professor Kuniński was born in Germany but teaches in Poland, and today is going to be engaged in this intellectual discussion about how Poland is dealing with the communist past and how Germany is as well. Our third speaker is Hubertus Knabe. Dr. Knabe is very well known in Germany and increasingly well known in Poland as well. The author of a number of books, the latest of which is The Culprit is, or The Culprits Are Among Us, which is in German. So far, I don't think it's been translated yet. He's the director of the Hohenschönhausen Memorial, which is the very important place where Germany is commemorating the victims of the Stasi in a prison of the Stasi, something that I don't think in Poland yet has happened. We may have a chance also to see Mr. Meckel this morning. He's not here yet, but if he does, I'll ask him to join our panel. And rather than spending more time with introductions, why don't I just invite Dr. Kamiński to begin his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, exactly in a month there will have been 18th anniversary of the elections of 4 June 1989, which triggered the process of fall of the communist regime in Poland. Therefore, one may pose a question, whether we should still deal with communist past. Shouldn't it be just a specialized field of research carried out by historians? Before this fundamental question is answered, please let me present the process of dealing with communist past in Poland now. It is carried out on several levels. The first one is of legal nature. It encompasses, on the one hand, punishing the perpetrators of crimes committed in the past for political or ideological reasons. But on the other hand, it is a process of broadly understood vetting. The prosecutors employed by the Institute of National Remembrance prosecute the perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and communist crimes. The latter will be subjected to limitation in 2020, and if their victims lost their lives, in 2030. Recently, the number of indictments submitted to courts is increasing systematically, both against the Stalinist period crime perpetrators and perpetrators of crimes committed more recently. Last month, for example, on the one hand, there was a sentence of 10 years in prison given in the case against a former officer of the communist security apparatus charged with the killing of the Polish Home Army soldier in 1946, and on the other hand, the indictment was filed to the court against the organizers of the martial law with the General Wojciech Jaruzelski in the lead. There has been the new statute on vetting in force in Poland for a few weeks now. In comparison with the previous one of 1997, the number of people subjected to vetting have been multiplied. Its authors assume that the citizens are entitled to know about the past of people who are public figures, starting with the members of parliament and ending with the journalists and academics. People subjected to vetting are obliged to file a special declaration whether they worked for or collaborated with the communist security apparatus. In the case of not revealing the truth about the past and the moment the fact is confirmed by court, the person shall be punished by preventing him or her holding public position for 10 years. The new vetting statute also provides for the publication of the list of all officers, secret collaborators, and victims of the communist security apparatus, as well as the list of leaders of the communist state by the Institute of National Remembrance. Right now, the advanced works aiming at introducing a new legal method of accounting for the communist past are conducted. It is so-called deubekizacja. The term stems from the word ubek, and that is a secret police sleuth. The term ubek is widely and used pejorative noun referring to the officer of the communist security services. The aim of the statute is, on the one hand, to prevent the former officers from holding public positions, and the other hand, to deprive them of disproportionately high pensions. Last year, the possibility of adopting a statute on so-called decommunization, which was to introduce the ban of taking a public position by the former functionaries of the Communist Party, was debated. However, it was assumed that the time which elapsed from 1989 was too long and made its implementation unrealistic. The second area of dealing with the past has a symbolic character. Its fundamental part was carried out in the 1990s. On the one hand, it consists of restoring the traditional name of the country and national symbols, and on the other hand, the changes in public sphere, changing the names of street, school patrons, etc. Unfortunately, the process has not been finished in many towns and cities so far. Many streets in cities still bear the name of People's Army. The People's Army was communist underground forces during the Second World War. Although the army fought against German occupant, it also prepared the overthrowing of legal authorities and supported new, this time Soviet, occupation. It is a kind of scandal that there are still streets in Poland bearing the name of General Stanisław Popławski, a Soviet officer in a Polish uniform who was in command of bloody pacification of the rebel organized by factory workers in Poznań in June 1956. The third and probably the most important area encompasses the activities concerning social consciousness and awareness. First and foremost, it is research into the period of communism and disseminating the results in the form of educational projects. They are one of the most important functions of the Institute of National Remembrance, which I am engaged into. The results of our work are the following. Firstly, more than 200 books and thousands of scholarly articles, and secondly, over 100 exhibitions, dozens of conferences, and hundreds of public lectures. Gradually, the truth of the communist past is being revealed, including the information on crimes and injustice classified for many years. The next stage is the work aiming and opening several museums presenting the crimes of the communist regime as well the resistance to the regime. Last but not least, there is the issue of reimbursement and redress for the victims of the communist system. It encompasses the possibility of having the sentences given for political reasons by the communist courts quashed, as well as the possibility of having damages paid out in some cases. The reprised person may obtain access to the documents gathered on van by the communist security apparatus. The Polish president has been consciously implementing a new policy on national orders and decorations for the last 2 years. This process plays an important role in doing justice, at least in a symbolic way, to people persecuted for their fight for independence and the human and civil rights. So it's time to come back to the main question, whether the activities of that sort have since nearly 20 years after the fall of the communist regime in Poland. There are many answers, thus I will try to present the most important arguments. The sequence of argument presentation is not connected with their importance. The most simple answer that the dealing with the communist past takes place now because it was not done earlier, just after 1989. In the 1990s, there was no vetting. The majority of the crime perpetrators were not punished. There were no actions undertaken in order to carry out systematical research into the communist dictatorship period, as it was, for instance, done by the German parliament. The documents of the security apparatus were not secured, and therefore they were being destroyed on mass scale even in 1990. The statute on the establishment of the Institute of National Remembrance was adopted as late as 1999, and the institute itself was set up in 2000. But in fact, it started its real operation 2 or 3 years later. Today, it is necessary to make up for delays for many years, and unfortunately, in the case of crimes, especially those committed in the Stalinist era, it is often too late. When we talk about prosecuting people who committed crimes, the most important argument is the sense of justice. Justice itself requires that the perpetrators of political murders or people who cruelly tortured innocent victims be punished. Since the perpetrators of those crimes were not prosecuted until 1989, and they were even subjected to special protective measures of the communist state, there is no question of applying the limitation or amnesty rules. What is unjust is not only refraining from punishing the perpetrators, but also keeping disproportion between the living standards of the torturers and their former victims. The officers of the security apparatus and the leaders of the Communist Party receive very high pensions from the state. However, their victims often have to live in poverty. It results, for instance, from the fact that the period they spend in prison or operating in conspiracy is not taken into account when calculating their pensions. There are hundreds of people living in Poland who had their health ruined completely as a result of reprisals. They do not receive any help from the state, contrary to the former communist leaders who have access to special governmental hospitals and healthcare centers. It is important to keep in memory the victims of the communist regime in Poland. Many thousand killed, hundreds of thousands of people imprisoned and persecuted in many other ways. The respect of those people makes us put increased efforts aiming at full understanding and explaining the contemporary history. We owe it to the people thanks to whom we regained our freedom and independence. Dealing with the communist past is important from the perspective of future generations too. We should provide them with a clear assessment of the attitudes present in the communist regime, which of them were heroic and which of them were treacherous. Similar assessments were given to us by preceding generations living in the period of Poland's partitions and those who experienced the cruelty of Second World War. Many people, politicians, journalists, artists, scientists, and scholars who pursued varied careers not because of their talent and hard work, but because of past misdeeds, who collaborated with the communist security apparatus, still play an important role in a public life. It always means the complicity in breaching human rights and treason, sometimes even complicity in crimes. Secret collaborators of security services made their careers at the cost at the expense of those who oppose the system. And that is a basic moral reason for vetting. The victims and public opinion have a right to know the names of the secret informants. The practical reason is the need to destroy the secret links and make it impossible to blackmail people with their past. In the communist system, both the reality and the past were counterfeited. History was constantly manipulated for propaganda reasons. Many false impressions were introduced to social awareness. The scholarly research and educational activities serve the purpose of getting to know the truth and the dissemination it among the society members. Such activities, as I have mentioned before, are undertaken mostly, but not only, by the Institute of National Remembrance. The aims which the creators of the Institute had in mind are best expressed in the preamble of the Act of the Institute of National Remembrance. I will quote it. Having regard to keeping in memory the vast number of victims, enormity of losses, and damage inflicted upon the Polish nation during the Second World War and after its ending, the Polish nation patriotic tradition of waging a fight against occupants, Nazism and communism, the deeds of Poles performed in order to re-establish independent Poland and to secure freedom and dignity, the obligation to prosecute crimes against peace, humanity, as well as war crimes, and the duty to express gratification and make compensation in order to redress all the injustice done by the state as a result of violating human rights, as we believe that unlawful acts of the authorities against its nation neither should be hidden under cover, nor should be forgotten, the Institute of National Remembrance shall be established. Contemporary history is not a typical episode in the history of Poland. It is not decisively behind us, and in numerous ways it affects our present day. It is to continue as long as the torturers, executioners, and their victims are still alive, as long as the truth of the past is not revealed, as long as the long-lasting effects of the totalitarian regime are not overcome. A significant part of people living in our world had to deal with the experience of the communist systems. On the one hand, it was the experience of the terror and persecutions, unprecedented attempt to change the social relations and human awareness and consciousness. But on the other hand, it was the experience of a heroic fight for the basic values. Each nation marked by the communism has a right to face its own past. This right should not be questioned, as it's sometimes done by those who were lucky then and could live in peace and freedom. It may happen one day that the nations who were independent and enjoyed their liberty before 1989, living in the free parts of the world, will decide to face their own past. They may then ask a question, whether during the decades of communist rule in nearly half of the world, they did enough to support the fight of others for freedom and democracy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Let me introduce Mr. Markus Meckel from the Bundestag in Berlin. And by way of introduction, let me say that Mr. Meckel gave a talk yesterday at the Kosciuszko Foundation, which Volker Berg kind of mentioned this morning, kind of set out some of the issues, all of the issues that we will be talking about today. Our next speaker is Professor Milewit Kuniński, who I invite to the podium.
ladies and gentlemen, I'm a philosopher, not a historian, to some extent a political theorist. Nevertheless, I'm trying to say something about the what I call the disordered pace of dehumanization in Poland. And let me explain why it is a disordered pace. I begin with the title of a booklet which was written by Bronisław Wildstein and published by the Center for Political Thought in Krakow in 2001. The title can be translated into English, Dehumanization Which Never Happened. In other words, what we are talking about in Poland is something which began after 1989 but never was ended in a proper way. And what we have now is the vetting law, which was introduced in 1997, and then it was amended by the President Kaczynski quite recently, and in 2007 the new version of the vetting law is in power. Now the problem is that it can be regarded as a new stage of dehumanization, but mostly the new stage of screening or vetting process. But nevertheless, it is interesting to see why the process of dehumanization was in fact reduced to a certain version of the screening, and why the dehumanization process was in many ways stopped or undermined by some political forces, not necessarily on the side of the former communists, which would be quite understandable, but also by part of the former members of the anti-communist opposition. So let me give you a sort of overview of the history of dehumanization efforts in Poland, and let me make some remarks on this issue. I would begin with the idea that there is a broad sense of dehumanization, and of course there is a technical definition of dehumanization which was used by Polish and German theorists who met in the end of 1999 in Krakow, and the result of that meeting and very interesting discussions on different sides, on different aspects of dehumanization, was a book entitled From Totalitarianism to Democracy, which was again published by the Center for Political Thought. And I'm going to talk something about this more precise definition, but let me begin with the broad sense of dehumanization. I think that in a very broad sense, dehumanization can be seen as having its pre-1989 period, that is the time of popular resistance against communism. And here we can mention all risings and movements in Eastern Bloc, beginning with Berlin or Germany, as was explained by Markus Meckel yesterday in 1953, and going through numerous risings in Poland in 1956, 1968, 1970, 1976, and 1980, you name it. There are a number of risings. And again, of course, we should not forget about Prague Spring in 1966, although it was a limited kind of rising against communism because of this idea of some kind of democratic socialism. Nevertheless, it can be also regarded as a process preparing for the change of the system. Now, this, I think, is also very important to have in mind that in Germany, and particularly in Poland, the churches played a role. In Germany, Protestant church, and in Poland, the Catholic Church. And I'm not going to explain you why the Catholic Church is so important for Polish people, and because this is a very well-known thing. But what is important is that the role of the Catholic Church in Poland, and as I understand, to some extent, of the Protestant churches in Germany, in Eastern Germany, of course, was that it provided a sort of moral role models and certain moral rules which, based in Christianity, were responsible for the attitude towards the surrounding and hostile communist system. People used to live in two realities, so to speak. That is to say, in a private life, they sticked to the rules, moral rules of Christianity, and sometimes they wanted to be moral in the public life, and at the same time they were surrounded by a completely amoral environment which was created by communism. Now, to understand dehumanization as a process, we have to have in mind these preconditions, and it seems to me that those changes which took place before 1989 in Eastern Europe were necessary not only for the collapse, as a necessary condition for the collapse of the communist system, which began in 1989 in Poland, that then was dispersed onto Eastern Germany and in Czechoslovakia in those days. But what is important is that that was the beginning of the systematic destruction of what I would call the reliability of communist regime and its ideology. Without that undermining of the moral credibility of that ideology and communist system as such, there would be no 1989. But it doesn't mean, of course, that I'm trying to tell you that dehumanization is something which began in 1953. That would be absurd. But nevertheless, this historical events and the historical process were necessary for the major change. Now, the second point is that in Poland, as many of analysts and historians claim, there was no turning point. Although 1989 semi-free, if I may say so, elections, because the fully free general elections took place in 1990. That was the beginning of the collapse of communism in Poland, but at the same time, because of the preparatory actions taken by the representatives of the anti-communist opposition and representatives of the communist regime before 1989, which led to the so-called round table talks, in a sense weakened the possibility of having the turning point as a quite clear cutting off the system, the former system, and beginning something anew with the perspective of proper assessment of the past. And we had this conflict within the opposition, which was taken to the surface after 1989, that there were different ideas about the changes which were necessary for the new reborn sovereign Poland to become a really democratic, liberal, and at the same time morally based political system together with free market economy. The problem was that in those days, just before the talks of the Round Table, there was a sort of agreement between the representatives of the anti-communist or democratic opposition, as it was sometimes called. And the major figures within this oppositional movement, Adam Michnik and Geremek and Mazowiecki, were of the idea that because we are trying to negotiate with the communists, so unfortunately they have to be accepted as our partners. And that kind of partnership led to something which was then called a fraternization during the round table talks. And psychologically, this could be quite understandable, but politically, of course, it was very dangerous, because after some time it turned out that those opposition leaders, once they became involved in real politics after the first 1989 June elections, were not able to see that the situation has changed dramatically. And the popular saying, which was promoted by Bronisław Geremyk was that pacta sunt servanda. In other words, that we have to keep to the results of the negotiations, that we have no possibility, moral justification of the major change of the situation. And the major change meant, of course, that all apparatchiks should have been banned from all political crucial positions. And let me remind you, or let me tell you to those who were not aware of that the first non-communist prime minister had at least two communist ministers of two major ministries, that is Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Interior. So he was a democratically elected by the same prime minister of the new reborn Poland's government, but two major posts were still held by former communists, and those communists were involved in prosecutions before 1989, and they were responsible for the imposition of the martial law. That was the result of the idea that we should keep to the negotiated agreements in the beginning of the in the spring of 1988. In a sense, there are people who claim, and I think that are quite right, that it had an influence, or a bad influence, on the situation in Poland after 1989. And even the question of the Soviet army, which was still on the Polish soil in 1989, was regarded by the new independent sovereign government with suspicion. That was a talk given by, or rather an explanation given by Tadeusz Mazowiecki, that we'd better keep those Soviet soldiers on the Polish soil close to the German border, because we don't know what will happen in Germany after the unification. And of course, I'm not trying to repeat the accusations, because I do understand that under the no full knowledge about the situation, particularly of the intentions of the Soviets, the possible solutions were different, and some of them looked rather risky. But that kind of attitude to slow down the process of decommunization in a broad sense, that is coming out of the old system, was something which was quite typical of the new government. Now, decommunization was also defined by some of the former apparatchiks, and by the way, I have in mind Józef Oleksy, who then became the prime minister of the sovereign Poland, being at the same time the former apparatchik, that what he claimed was that, in fact, decommunization is a process of building democracy and a free market economy, full stop. So what we need to decommunize, or how to put it as a proper verb, or make decommunization in Poland is enough to introduce free market and have liberal democracy. He deliberately was not trying to say anything about the moral grounding of the liberal democracy. It was something we should adapt quite easily. That is to say, have free elections, have sovereign government, have two chambers of parliament, and that's all. In other words, purely constitutional and formal arrangements would be necessary to have liberal democracy in Poland, which is not, of course, true, as those of you who know history of politics in Europe and in America know quite well. Now, the problem was that after some time, Adam Michnik, for example, together with Aleksander Kwaśniewski, who became president of Poland for 10 years, had been adding to the emergence of the foundational myth of the independent Poland, which said that the abolition of communism in Poland and changing it into a democratic country was a common achievement of the most important sections of anti-communist opposition and liberals within the Communist Party. Now, even if it is to some extent true, on the whole, the that kind of analysis of the situation is false, because in a sense those liberals in inverted commas were somehow forced to accept the situation because of the collapse of the economy, because of the loss of the moral credibility, and with the processes which were taking place for some time in the Soviet Union. Now, this Arcadian picture justified the attitude of the opinion leaders and politicians within the first non-communist government. And in a sense, it was combined with the sort of Christian or rather pseudo-Christian attitude towards a possible decommunization, or something which would be equal to revenge and the witch hunt. And witch hunt is the key word, or the weasel word, which is used even now. And to understand why the word is used now, we have to go back to the more precise definition of the decommunization. Now, if you want to understand what decommunization is, something which is a sort of procedure rather than a very long-term process, we have to have in mind that it can be reduced to a legal abolition of political rights of the former members of nomenklatura. This is a very narrow, but at the same time, I think, to the point definition of what is decommunization. But of course, you can expand the notion to some extent which is still acceptable and without pumping it too much. Well, it can be defined as the procedure of the abolition, as I mentioned before, but also we can include the procedure of lustration or screening or vetting law. The lustration comes from Czech word lustrace, which comes again from Latin, as a sort of purification. But of course, it has not that meaning not in Polish language, but in legal procedures which were finally introduced. It's not about purification, it's about finding out whether people who had any kind of secret collaboration actions with the secret police before 1989 and beginning in 1944 are ready to recognize it in public, that is to declare in a special kind of documents that they were collaborators. And finally, we end up with the idea of the screening or vetting laws, which were quite similar to the ones in Czechoslovakia, that it is enough if someone lied and he had to be punished for that, and he should be banned for at least 10 years from taking any posts in academia as it is now, or in politics as it was in the beginning. So we have that idea that which to some extent we borrowed, or maybe it was simply an analogy to something which was introduced in Czechoslovakia, that people who collaborated with the police, who collaborated but did not commit any crimes against human rights or had no murders in the records, should not be banished for being collaborators, but can be banished for trying to cover it. And the idea was that covering it, hiding it, would be disastrous for the major institutions, social and political institutions in Poland or in any Eastern European country, because of the influence of the former secret police and, of course, of the former Soviet secret police, because there were close links, as you understand, between the secret police in any of these Eastern European countries, including Poland, and with the Soviet headquarters. Now, the next aspect of the broad sense of these, not broad sense, but the broadened sense of the decommunization is the rehabilitation of those who were punished by the communists for no reason, or rather the reasons were purely ideological. But also, it had something to do not only with the criminal law, but also with the civil law. That was the idea of reprivatization, that is, giving back what was owned by the Poles or their descendants before 1944. And finally, the part of the dehumanization was the punishing or penalization of the communist crimes. Now, let me now tell you something about the short history of the law. What was important, that was in the beginning, that was a sort of vetting procedure which was used against the former secret police agents. That was the idea that Poland should create its special forces and secret service. But of course, to find out whether some of those former members of the secret police could be hired had to be prepared in a proper way. So a sort of procedure was introduced, and that was still not a part of the screening law. It was a screening procedure specifically for the former secret agents. And out of 14,500 persons who sought appointment, 8,000 were approved for the employment in Ministry of Interior, and 4,000 were accepted for work in State Protection Office. That is a new secret service bureau. The rest went to police forces and private security agencies. Yes. And the first attempt at dehumanization law was in 1992. That was the time when the Prime Minister Olszewski introduced that kind of law. And then in 1997, the first and expanded law on screening was passed by the Parliament. And recently, in 2006, it was amended, and it not only included those who were appointing for the posts in the governmental structure, but also within the academia and business and the media. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning I would like to thank for the occasion of participating in this conference. It was a pleasure to accept your invitation, not only because New York City is a wonderful city compared to my working place in Germany, with more than 200 cells and interrogation rooms, a very sad place, and each occasion to come out, it's a pleasure to accept for me. No, the main reason is that I'm interested to discuss with our Polish colleagues about how to deal with communist past. And what I heard before, the situation is really very similar, but we don't discuss very often about these questions. So it's a good occasion to do it here. I wrote a book, as you mentioned already, about how Germany is dealing with the communist past. It has just been published some weeks ago, and I cannot summarize this book here in a few minutes, but perhaps some facts I can mention. After the end of communist system in East Germany, 19 responsibles for the communist dictatorship went into prison. So 19 responsibles compared to more than 200,000 people who had been in prison, more than 250 people who have been killed at the borders, and more than 50 people who have been sentenced to death from the East German justice. The victims are still discriminated. You mentioned the same of Poland, because they are still suffering because they get very low pensions compared to the former leadership in East Germany. And the figures are really very sad, I think. Last year, Germany spent more than 4 billion euro for the pensions of the former leadership in East Germany. More than 200 millions get only the former employees of the secret police, and the so-called victim pension, which is discussed now, and on Monday there will be a hearing in the Bundestag, will cost 39 millions. So you see the big difference between billions and millions for the victims and for the culprits. In the final years of the GDR, when Mikhail Gorbachev reigned in Moscow and the communist system had started to crumble, the following joke circulated. A Soviet and a Polish and an East German dog meet and exchange the experiences. The Soviet dog says excitedly, "At home I just have to bark and immediately I get meat." Looking blank, the Polish dog asks, "Meat? What's that?" And the East German dog, just as puzzled, replies, "Barking. What's that?" As is so often the case with dictatorships, this people's joke gives a very accurate portrayal of the situation in these three countries towards the end of the Soviet system. All three participants in this conversation share the experience of communism, but its application differs from country to country. In the Soviet Union, rulers have to shrink away from the discontent of the people after slackening the oppressive reins a bit. In Poland, is less strongly developed in the final years. People are mainly affected by shortfalls of supplies. The GDR, on the other hand, is ruled by an openly oppressive regime, offering hardly any space for protest. However we look back on the history of communism in Germany and Poland, which lasted for over 40 years, we mainly find striking similarities. In both states, the communist regime was founded on the bayonets of the Red Army. The same troops which marched into the former Poland in 1944 later pushed forward into Germany. In their tow, so-called front agents of the Soviet People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the NKVD, immediately after the invasion, they started systematically arresting opponents of the Soviet regime. In Poland, as in Germany, provisional prisons and camps were set up, many of which had previously been used as custody facilities by the Nazis. The methods with which all these arrests were executed were very similar. Arrests were made based on certain lists or denunciations, followed by brutal interrogations and violently enforced confessions, with communist underground organizations and security forces doing the legwork. In both countries, the occupiers intended to eliminate independent democratic political power and to subdue the occupied terrain once and for all with the help of communist henchmen. Whereas a lot of Germans and Poles had been rather opposed to each other before, they suddenly found themselves sharing the same basement cell with their previous enemies and many mixed settlements. The same applied to the camp of the Gulag, into which 10,000s of prisoners from the conquered areas were deported. Here also Germans and Poles suddenly met again. In the course of the Soviet expansion towards the West, both people also shared the experience of being banished from the ancestral habitat. Whereas in East Poland, transports were organized to displace the Polish population westwards, millions of Germans also lost their home only a few hundred kilometers further west. Due to former crimes committed by the SS and the armed forces in Poland, procedures against the German people were a lot more brutal than against the Polish people in East Poland. After the massacre, the East German population was decimated by more than 2 million people who had fled or been expelled. But even so, the trauma of losing one's homeland was very similar. Most frequently, it hit rural and small town communities who had lived their lives far away from big politics. They had to leave everything familiar to them overnight and were forced to start a completely new life further west. And often they were seen as invaders, even by their own people. So for me it's surprising that Germans in Poland most frequently have such opposing attitudes when it comes to the issue of expulsion. The shared experience of being at the mercy of Soviet expansion and deportation policy hardly seems to come into play. Neither does the ideological basis of this gigantic human displacement, Stalinist communism. The recent exhibition I saw in Berlin at Erzwungene Wege, Forced Migration, which was dedicated to expulsions in Europe, pinpoints all sorts of possibly responsible ideologies. Only one ideology trend was missing in that list, and that was communism. Also, after the establishment of communist regime structures, Germans and Poles had rather similar experiences. In both states, the communist parties only represented a dwindling minority in society. Particularly in the first few years, all alternative political powers were persecuted, brought in line, or liquidated with enormous brutality. Thousands of resistance fighters against communism were put into the camps and prisons of the new Polish or East German state authorities. The revolts in GDR in 1953 and in Poland in 1956, however, demonstrated the unquenched thirst for freedom both peoples shared. Their violent suppression showed the implacability of the communist rulers. The continued resistance against the collectivization of agriculture, which in GDR could only be broken through the building of the Berlin Wall, and not at all in Poland, as well as the assertiveness of the churches in an atheist totalitarian state, are further similarities of the experience of communism, which lasted over 40 years. Another link between Germany and Poland is the peaceful transition to democracy, including the acceptance of the Round Table, which was invented in Poland and copied in GDR. All the more surprising, then, that these shared experiences hardly play a role in German-Polish relations. Apart from some compliments the German government paid to the first independent trade union in Poland, Solidarność, the communist history is not really addressed between the two governments. One of the reasons of that could be that such discussions, if ever they happen, are led nearly exclusively from a national perspective. In Poland, as in most other countries of the former Eastern Bloc, the victory over Soviet communism is celebrated as the rebirth of the nation. Even in Germany, where one is downright afraid of a known national feeling, where one gets scared even by people waving the national flag for their team during the Football World Cup last year, even in Germany, the discussion about one's communist past is predominantly led from a national perspective. A cross-national or even European point of view hardly comes into play. This is why the shared experience of communism does not unite Germany and Poland, but instead even divides the two countries. A similar phenomenon could be witnessed in Western Europe right after the end of National Socialism. The victory over the Nazi regime was primarily interpreted as a national triumph. In France or the Netherlands, Germans were still bad-mouthed as Nazis in the 70s, even if one was born years after the war. The insight that in 1945 it was not one nation's victory over another, but the victory of democracy over tyranny, this only developed much later. The avowal of freedom, constitutional legality, and a peaceful foreign policy took center stage in the cross-national canon of values in Europe. The bitter experience of National Socialism and the Second World War formed the historical backdrop for a new Europe without which the EU would never have developed as dynamically. Such an internationalization of the past still has happened for communism. Yes, there have been repeated attempts of individual Eastern European states to raise the examination of one's communist history up to a European level. But in Western Europe and in Brussels, interest in this issue is rather limited. The question of how the people responsible should be punished, we heard about the problems in Poland before, for decades of communist oppression has, in contrast to the invasion of the Allies in Germany, never been discussed on a European level. Every country had to find its own way of extracting burdened officials from compromised administrations and of dealing with leftover communist organizations and terror apparatuses. Brussels, which otherwise even regulates the bending of a banana, did not even accept responsibility for the compensations of victims. Another broad area Europe did not touch was the political education in schools, memorials, museums, and other institutions of social enlightenment. It was left to each individual country to teach future generations about the dictatorial past. Also, it should have been of great interest to Europe as a whole to counteract the glorification of communism. This is the problem now in Germany. This kind of nostalgic view backwards. Even with political declarations, which only cost Brussels the paper they are printed on, the examination of the communist past hardly comes into play. When I suggested something like this in March 2007 to the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, I got the following reply only a few days ago. A trans-European initiative in remembrance of the victims of communism is difficult due to the vast differences in which each state of the European Union deals with its communist history. Hence, it will most probably not be realizable during the German EU presidency. End of quotation. In contrast to the European Union, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has indeed, and twice already, in 1996 and 2006, passed a declaration on dealing with the communist past. In its resolution number 1481 from January 2006, it criticizes the fact that the fall of totalitarian communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe has not been followed in all cases by an international investigation of the crimes committed by them. Moreover, the authors of these crimes have not been brought to trial by the international community, as was the case with the horrible crimes committed by National Socialism. Consequently, public awareness of crimes committed by totalitarian communist regimes is very poor. Communist parties are legal and active in some countries, even if in some cases they have not distanced themselves from the crimes committed by totalitarian communist regimes in the past. The resolution continues with the following statement. The Assembly is convinced that the awareness of history is one of the preconditions for avoiding similar crimes in the future. Furthermore, moral assessment and condemnation of crimes committed play an important role in the education of young generations. The clear position of the international community on the past may be a reference for the future actions. Moreover, the Assembly believes that those victims of crimes committed by totalitarian communist regimes who are still alive, or their families, deserve sympathy, understanding, and recognition for their sufferings. End of quotation. When the Central and Eastern European states joined the EU, the historical European heritage was extended by the experience of over 40 years of communist rule. One of the most important political cultural tasks after the EU extension in 2004 is coming to terms with it now. Especially the fate of millions of persecuted people and the multifaceted resistance against communist dictatorships have to be communicated to a wide public. Because to a great degree, a united Europe draws its liberal identity from the painful experiences with totalitarian systems during the 20th century. Memorials and museums about communist dictatorships play a central part in the promotion of an anti-totalitarian culture of remembrance. These were set up everywhere in Central and Eastern Europe after the peaceful revolutions in 1989, mostly at authentic locations of persecution, like in Hohenschönhausen. They form a central, if negative, component of the European cultural heritage. Nowhere else is a dictatorship character as apparent as in these places. In their respective countries, these places have become epicenters for accounting for one's recent history. But in contrast to the communist system itself, the culture of remembrance that was created this way mainly features a national focus. A shared European perspective has so far hardly been developed at all. I believe that Germany and Poland could develop joint initiatives, particularly in examining the communist past. That way they could become pacemakers for the whole of Europe. Germany could act as a bridge between East and West. After all, its western part was a founding member of the European unification process, while its eastern part shares the experience of communist dictatorship with Eastern Europe states. Possibly joint initiatives could be a trans-European ban of communist symbols and other forms of glorification of communist dictatorship. The German government doesn't agree with the initiatives of Eastern European countries, unfortunately. A unified regulation of compensation claims for victims of communist persecution. Initiation of a European fund for memorials and museums of communism as well as political education methods. Setting up a European institute to come to terms with communism from a trans-European perspective. Encouraging youth exchange programs to come to terms with the European history of communism, similar to the history of National Socialism. Developing a European curriculum in schools on how to teach the era of communism in history classes. Planning and realizing immigration European exhibition on communist persecution in Eastern and Central Europe. Setting up and hosting a European web portal, History of Communism in Europe. Clustering national associations of expellees with the involvement of the International Prisoners' Aid Association. foundation of a European Film Award for the critical examination of communist dictatorships. These are only a few proposals possible in my point of view. Closer collaboration between Germany and Poland in dealing with the communist past could contribute towards taking the historical discussion out of its narrow context of national history and towards creating a shared European culture of remembrance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Knappe. Those were very good ideas. I parenthetically would like to say that on Monday, the students of Columbia University commemorated the 110 million victims of communism right here on campus. So things can definitely happen. Mr. Matko.
I have to thank you for the invitation too, and I would like to give some remarks and not to be long, that we have some discussion about that. If we see the situation in Germany to deal with communism, we from the beginning had some specialities. At first, when we began with that, after the peaceful revolution, it was clear that with unification, the communist part is only one part which has really experienced communism, and that we are in a whole state with a majority of the society. That means a majority of politicians too, on every level. And especially on the federal level, we are only a fifth of parliamentarians elected in the East who have that experience. And you have to communicate and to make understandable what does it mean on the federal level and every time. And so that from the beginning was a special condition for us in Germany. The second was that we, in every time, we had the experience in which way Germany dealt with the National Socialism. And that comparison was the background for all what we have done in Germany dealing with communist past. That in some parts was a benefit. In some parts it was a disadvantage. And the third is, and I think that's not a specialty for Germany, but it's a specialty compared to National Socialism for our point of view. That National Socialism was coming and created from Germany, brought to other countries with all injustice, war, and whatever happened, including Holocaust. The communist past, we in Germany were only a little part of an empire, a global empire or a European empire. The decisions, the main decisions were made in Moscow, and in every time you have to be aware that to deal with communist past, you have only a past of that communist empire. Every of our national states are only a part of that, and that, in my view, is until now not enough aware, and in dealing it, not enough implemented, because that means we really understand the communism only if we have the whole picture, and not only our national perspective. The second point to differentiate it was made, I can make it short. The challenges are differentiated. One, you have to deal with victims, to compensate them, to acknowledge them, to give them back their dignity. The second is how to deal with that people who belong to the communist system in the different levels. And the question is and was, is only belonging to that the special point, or is it only personal, have personal guilty and responsibility for crimes? that's not so easy sometimes to differentiate, because decisions were making in boards and gremiums. And the question is, what is the personal responsibility in that? We had that discussion because bringing people of that system, of the Politburo, in the question of that, wie nennt der Schießbefehl, wie sagt man, the order to shoot in the border. And there was a discussion, who's responsible for that? We brought to the prison some of them, of the soldiers and people who were concrete shot. But it was not their own willing only. They got the order. And to bring that line to the court, it was not so easy, but in that we succeeded. We succeeded, and we brought that people from the Politburo to the court, and I think that was a success. Then I think very important is a public awareness about communism. And that especially is not so easy if you have different experiences in the society. And if the majority of the society has no own experiences, it's a difference than in Poland. In Poland, the whole society had that experience. In Germany, we are only a few, and so the public remembrance is difficult to shape by that thing. And then the last point is to have in the background for all what we deal with communism, the question, what is with the singularity of National Socialism? So we have to be aware that I think in Germany, after decades, we have a common understanding and judgment about National Socialism. But we don't have it about communism. And not only in Germany, but in Europe at all. And that's the challenge we have to deal with. We began with that dealing with past at the round table, when we established the round table in December 89. And I think this is a difference. It is clear that it was sometime later than in Poland. When we borrowed that table from Poland in December, it was 10 months later, and the end of the round table in Poland was that semi-election, semi-free election. For us, in the beginning it was clear that we will have a free election, but the question was, we needed the round table to find solutions, for instance, for the election law and for that transitional period until to get the election. There was quite different tasks for that round table, and so we dealt in that time with the question of how to deal with that, how to break the power of Stasi and so on. So there are some differences too between Poland and East Germany concerning the round table. And so we raised that question of dealing with that past in the round table yet. And then after the free election, we dealt with that in the free elected Volkskammer, the parliament. And the most of that, what was decision later in the common German Bundestag, began in the Volkskammer. Often is the awareness in other countries that what we have done in Germany in dealing with communist past was initiated from the West, which is completely wrong. It was from the beginning that, for instance, to opening the files was not the initiative of the West, it was the initiative from us in the East. And it was not so easy to convince the Western politicians in Germany, Schäuble, Kohl, and others, who were in power at that time, to convince them really to open the files. They wanted to put it away for 30 years because they were aware that that files had some information about Western Germany too. And so they were a little bit afraid what could be written there in that file. That is one point, and the other point is, what does it mean for reconciliation of a society? And I think it's really important issue. There were a fear of Rache. Was heißt das? Was? Okay, das ist es. Ich habe es nicht verstanden, aber Sie haben es verstanden. Revenge, yeah, okay. There was a fear of revenge. And I can tell you that I don't know single case in which such violent revenge happened. There was in the beginning a very important fear about that. And so I can tell you that because we opened the files, that everybody who was a victim can find and get his own files. I have at home, Ordner, 8 of that. Such a one, it's 1 meter. It's very interesting and crazy sometimes what they have written there. But there was, and you can find names there who cooperated with Stasi in order to press you and all these things to give information and so. And we were really, there was a fear. And so I can tell you that everybody who got that file had his own decision how to deal with that information. Sometimes, some of them, I looked for contact with them who gave that information and asked, why you have done it? Sometimes it was possible, sometimes not, to have that contact. And I can tell you that I would say that opening of files created in thousands and of thousands cases reconciliation in the society. So the contrary, what was feared in the beginning. And so I think that was a very important decision which we done very early in the Volkskammer and then implemented later in the German Bundestag. Then that was one very important institution, and we opened it for victims. We opened the files in order to get information about people who belonged to the system, to Stasi not only, but who was involved and cooperated with that. And important is to know the so-called name EM, informal cooperator. That is a criterion of Stasi in which many different cases are involved. And that you have to, sometimes in the public debate in Germany, it's all the same, which is not the same. There are people who are agents of Stasi. They worked and tried to influence churches, opposition groups, and so on. There are others who, as young pupil or people in the army, had some pressure and they signed and gave some information. Some of them, very orderly, gave information. Some of them agreed with a friend to give that information because they was under pressure and they dealt without any disadvantage for the other because they agreed what he's writing. And there are others who did it under pressure. And so, in many other cases, and so it is very important not only to use the name EM, but really to see what happened in concrete. Because there are very different concrete cases under that title of EM. And so if you really would like to meet the concrete situation, you have to do it in the case-by-case decision. Then we had the justice, there was said some things about it, can't be so long. Then we created, it was my personal initiative in the parliament in the 90s, a so-called Enquete Commission. During 2 periods of the German Bundestag, we made a commission with partly parliamentarians of all parties, and on the other hand, experts. to deal with all these issues and to make it public. That was very important in that time because all public attention was going to only to Stasi questions and not to the whole field of influence of the whole society, what that communist system affects. And so I think that was an important thing. And in the end, for instance, we established the foundation for dealing with that communist past on the federal level. And the importance was that we did it almost completely in the consensus between the parties in the parliament. That's, in my view, a very important point, that it was possible to find a consensus about that issues. And so we established that foundation. The compensation questions to victims I will deal with later. And I think that's very important to make clear that it's could really a damaging public effect if there is an impression in public, in the society, that dealing with past is instrumentalized for political reasons. If there is that, and it's clear that every political power and party has a tendency to do so, but there was a strong awareness between us that this is wrong and that you need clear criteria to deal with that. That the rule of law is a very important issue in dealing with that, and yet you can't deal with them as the communists dealt with their victims. We have to do it in a democratic way with the rule of law in every stage. And so I think that was a very important point, and I think this will play a role if you judge about the processes today in Germany and, for instance, in Poland. And to be frank, it was raised yesterday, what happens today with Geramek, in my view, is a very important problem. And it is a disadvantage what's happening now in the public acceptance of Poland, exactly for that field. And I think we will discuss it during the day. But I think that's a very important point for exactly that question, that instrumentalizing that past in the political fight is a disaster for public acceptance of dealing with that past. We have that. We had that in Germany too. For instance, Adenauer in the beginning of the 60s took that past that Willy Brandt was an immigrant, and he didn't suffer the presence of Hitler in Germany. He used against Willy Brandt in the election campaign, in other times. And so I think that's a point which is a question of the political culture, and it will shape the political culture for the future. Coming to the end, I think it's very important to make clear that communism is not only a national challenge, it's a European one. But I disagree in one point with what Hubertus said, in order of the responsibility of the institutions of European Union. I don't think that it's a question for them. But I agree with you that it's really a European challenge. And all that proposals, I think, are very important. We have to meet the European public and understand it. And if what I mentioned yesterday, the judgment about in the European judgment and awareness about the end of the war, as we had in the 60th anniversary, that's a challenge for us. I would say that has never happened again. We have to shape it in another way. Or that we have a consensus about National Socialism, but not about communism. That's a challenge for us. And only together we will change it. And so I think Let's look for institutions, let's look for communication in the cross-border history, political, or historical policy, in order to exchange our views, not to bring all that together, to have only one, that won't be possible, but bring it together and to challenge and to shape European understandings. I think it will take a long time, but it's needed to begin with such institutions. And I really think that that network of remembrance and solidarity, which is agreed between some countries in the Central Europe, could be such an instrument, exactly for that issues, and not only about that to honor the victims, which is really very important, but also to remember and to make clear that what I mentioned yesterday, European heritage of freedom beyond the Iron Curtain. The uprisings not only, and we don't know each other enough about that, and Western Europe really knows only the big chapters of that. But there's much more. It's a single situation. Such kind of films as we had with Das Leben der anderen, how to say it, the life of the others. And all these things, the little and the big chapters of that heritage, that in my view would be a really important challenge for us together, and we need institutions for that. Why not a research institute in Poland for exactly that as a part of that network? Why not, for instance, a museum of Cold War in Berlin, which in my view is not only a German issue, it is a European and global one. And all these things to shape a better European understanding for that communism and to prevent it for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Herr Meckel. My Polish colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong, but the only case of revenge that I can recall was when General Jaruzelski was beamed with a brick in Wrocław in, I think it was 1993 or 1994.
By a former opposition member.
But I don't recall any other sort of revenge being taken at any time. We have only a few minutes for discussion, and I think what we will do to streamline this a little bit is to ask for questions and then have the panelists answer 4 or 5 questions, which we'll take now. Professor Krasnodębski.
I have a comment, not really question, maybe one question. Because I think that the most important question was formulated by Hubertus Knabe, who asked why this common experience didn't play the role, in the Polish-German relation, the role we all expected, because it's really shared experience, and we know. And I would say one of the reasons, one answer I can give is that, when I read also German press, but also I have the German politicians, they always said the best partner of Germany, in Germany, are Polish post-communists, Kwaśniewski, Miller, Rosati. Even more, we have heard from the Polish papers that some very important Polish intellectuals connected with opposition were the people who prevented in Poland dealing with the past, like Geremek, like Michnik, and so on. Yeah, and they receive a status in Germany, also in the public discussion, the cult figures, which are not, you couldn't really criticize them, and nobody really knows how hot there were political debates in Poland, and how, in a way, extreme position all these people had in this discussion. So this is one of the questions. What do you think about? What is the reason? I would say the same is probably with the question of expulsion. We were talking about this in the afternoon. But I think, for me, it's a very striking, you know, even if I read the book by Norman Neumark, or I had days ago, a week ago here, that the expulsion of Germans are normally depicted, described as a nationalistic act by Poles, yeah? So many writers like Neumark are writing about Nazi crimes and then Polish crimes, and not Nazi crimes and communist crimes, or German crimes and Polish crimes. You know, it's if you look at the vocabulary or the language, it is very, very characteristic. And the third one is Europe and the role of Europe. You know, I cannot understand. We have heard that Poland was very slow with the problems of communist past. Today, it started in Poland, and we have, especially in Europe, but also in Germany, you know, all this talk about witch hunts and so on and so on, yeah? All this demonstration. I would expect, especially from Germany, because Germany shared this, and Germany made it. You know, I remember the discussion in the middle of 90s when many German colleagues said to us, you know, we clean up, yeah, we are dealing with the communist past, we punished our Stasi collaborators. Why you Poles are so silent about the past? We started now the process, and what we can hear, and you know, at European Parliament and so on, nobody would say, yeah, besides, you know, of the individual cases we can quarrel about, yeah. But in principle, that this process, the process of democratization, is a right process, yeah. And this is my question is why? Why is it so that the reaction of the German public to all what, for instance, the Institute of National Remembrance is doing now? Why is it so negative? How you can explain it?
Janos. I'm not a specialist in the politics of history, so my remark is a very general and maybe naive one. Always in these discussions there pops up the issue of why the memory of the National Socialism is so vivid, whereas people don't think very much about the communist past, although there have been millions of deaths on both sides. And in a way it is true, it is outrageous. For example, there's a very posh bar in Berlin where there's a picture of Mao on the wall, and you could never imagine either in Berlin or any other place in the world being a picture of Hitler in the wall in this way. So in a way it is true, this is outrageous, and there are many reasons for that. For example, a certain left liberal milieu that does not want to confront its own errors in catering to communist regimes and in harboring the same erroneous and mistaken ideas about society. But on the other hand, and this is just my chosen as well, for this asymmetry in remembrance, and that is fascism, in a way, is an eternal temptation. There will always be xenophobia, the danger of nationalism, the danger of racism, whereas communism is not. We will not see it again, neither here, nor in Poland, nor in Germany. So there is a fundamental difference, in spite of the fact that both of the systems have put millions of people to death. And so I think there's not only this asymmetry due to a lack of consciousness, but there's also something in the substance as well.
Thank you for that sacred hope. John Trump.
Yes, one topic that was overlooked, I think, in comparing Germany with Poland was the issue of economics and private and public property transfers to private individuals after the collapse of communism. That Poland went through a period of shock therapy, whereas Germany didn't. Reunification took place, economic institutions were meshed rapidly. was wondering if somebody on the panel would care to comment about how illustration may or may not be linked with the effort to uncover irregularities during shock therapy, how former communist civil servants managed to transfer their lost political power into informal social power, money power under democracy.
Klaus Ziemer and then Eva.
I think it's very interesting to compare the experiences of Germany and Poland after 1989 and 90. Germany had the advantage of the failed denazification. It is true that it was the East Germans who formulated the laws, first in the Volkskammer and then in the Bundestag, but most, or at least some decisive leaders of the East Germans did know what happened in West Germany after the war. Gauck told this, that he was well aware in his socialization, they knew what had happened, and we can't be but be glad that they knew, and therefore it went completely, the development was completely different. And what is also remarkable is the high responsibility of the victims. You mentioned it, Marcus Meckel. They did not go to the public, and there could be a spirit of revenge. The opposite was the case, and also the institution, the authority led by Gauck and Birkler, enjoys public respect. And they are not suspect of functionalizing their information for political reasons. This is also a very important. And institutions as the churches in East Germany did their auto-illustration, and there were bitter hours for the churches when, for instance, two bishops were decovered as former IMs, informal cooperators, but then the atmosphere was clear. And we had clear criteria. For instance, I think this is a very good example, those who gave the orders to shoot at the wall. Egon Krenz was sentenced. He was put before the trial, and he got a prison, but he was not, the intention was not to destroy him as a person, but to reintegrate him. I saw in the media that during his prison time, he could work during the day and had to go back to prison during the night. The criteria were clear, what was good and what was right, and what was wrong. Poland had a much more difficult situation with the wrong table, and the big, how do you say, the Gruba Kreska, the big line, could have been, at that situation in '89, could the politicians of Solidarity have acted in a different way? I don't know. At least later on, the atmosphere was unclear, and it is until now, and perhaps it is too late in Poland. It is very sad to say how decommunization in some cases is used quite evidently to function for instrumentalized for political reasons. And we had the bitter example of the Catholic Bishop of Warsaw, who was to become Archbishop of Warsaw. And the church has to do something for itself. When we hear that perhaps 10% of the clergy had been IMs in Poland, this means some 2,000 persons. And you can imagine some people come out with the truth, like a salami tactic. In every situation where it is opportune, you can come out with a new name. Politica had a headline last year, the agent of the week. So this has to be cleared. This must be clear. And What seems to be, for me, a good idea is to create this network of which we have been talking since several years, not only in the direction of a network against expulsions in Europe, but also, and this has been proposed from the Polish side since 2 or 3 years, to make this also an institution which is dealing with totalitarian systems, and this may contribute to a common European conscience of not only the Second World War, but also of the time which we had in common after that. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like the panel to consider the reason why, one of the reasons why National Socialism became abhorrent, while communism has been sort of lightly let off. Well, one thing to remember is that the Soviet Union, unfortunately, was one of the victors, and victors write history. And also, it's 60 years since very spectacular destruction of National Socialism. But communism sort of petered out and had been for a long time embraced by the intellectuals of, many intellectuals of Western Europe. So could that be the reason why communism and the crimes of communism have not been brought out? They're only now starting to be addressed, maybe like the recent film, Lebens des Anders. And I know that Mr. Wajda has finished, I believe, the film on the massacre of Polish officers in Katyn. But it's all really not as spectacular as the ending. I was wondering whether we could have a comment on that.
Last question. Yeah, I just want to say that I know everybody sort of got excited, and that's great, but we're going to be discussing this all day, so there's going to be a chance to go back to these same issues in the different panels that follow. So please don't feel that if you don't get called out that you won't have a chance to say what you need to.
Mark Lahr, the former president of Estonia, wrote in his memoirs that when there were democratic elections in Estonia, the new government basically expelled all communists from the government, with some exceptions for Estonian communists who fought for Estonian independence. And he wrote in his memoirs, he cited numerous studies in the West which showed that the greater change in the political elite in the transition countries, the greater success of democracy and market economy. And it seems that in Poland and in Germany, this sort of very pragmatic option was not even considered, that the change of the elite is related to the success of the new democratic regime, and I wanted you to address that.
Okay, we've had a number of comments and a few questions, so who would like to respond either to the comments or the questions? I leave it open to you.
I want to say something about shock therapy. And, well, the problem was that the shock therapy, which began in 1990, after the imposition of the Leszek Balcerovic's plan, we had a number of beneficial results, but also we should have in mind that communists had a number of assets, and particularly the money they had from the USSR, the so-called Moscow loan. I can't remember the number, it was millions of dollars. And again, the money which was owned by the Communist Party, and the major source of the money was the central budget of the Communist Poland. And they also had real estates. And this was not nationalized and then privatized because of the opposition on the side of the former oppositionists, and in those days they were members of the parliament. So in other words, Adam Michnik was trying to say that we are not going to accept the idea that we will steal what was stolen. In other words, the communists should keep what they had. because it would be immoral and, in a sense, illegal to take from them what they had as a communist party. So one of the good examples of the creation of the economic institutions which guaranteed the position of the former communists within the economic institutions and then in the government was the so-called Big Bang, a very good name, because it was really big because the resources were quite large. And again, they were coming from the illegal sources. Let me give you an example. In 1990, the communist system were able to keep their position because of the money they owned. And what was owned by the party then was used as the private assets in different institutions, including banks. That would be the explanation.
If I could add something to these remarks, the process of privatization in Poland started already in the second half of 80s. So in 1989, the only one social group prepared for free market, liberal rules in economy were the former communists. When we are talking about security apparatus, they started in 1986 and 1987 the process of founding a lot of companies, also with foreign capital, and the process of so-called privatization of I will try to say it some other way. In 1988, there was adopted a special new law introducing, in fact, the free market in Poland. So, in this moment, the process of creating so-called nomenclatura companies started. And the nomenclatura companies were the private companies, but using the state factories. For example, the state factory produced some goods, but the goods were sold by the private company, and all income was to these private companies. In 1989, we had 1,600 such companies. They all were owned by the former nomenclatura members.
Let me start with the remark over there that communism will never come again, so it's not a danger. I don't agree with it. The biggest country in the world is ruled by a communist party, China. And I think, especially in future, when we hear the discussions in European countries as well, about regulating everything from the side of the state, it's really a danger if we don't know what happened with such concepts in the past, to bring people the happiness even if they don't want to get it. So I think we need this confrontation with our past, and I think the picture of national socialism is so much clearer that there is no real danger of doing it again. But communism is, the awareness in the public opinion is very, very bad. For example, in the younger generation, if we ask pupils visiting the memorial site in Berlin, who was Erich Honecker, they don't know anything. They don't know any name, anything what happened, and so they are. I think it's a real danger that they are not really immunitated of this communist past. We must teach them what happened, that they can learn about the past. Markus Meckel seemed to be very satisfied about the development in Germany with dealing with the past. I cannot agree with him at this point, because I think we made very big mistakes. Very big mistakes, especially of punishing the responsibles. Only one employee of State Security Service of East German secret police went into prison. Only one employee. only 4 members of the Politburo went into prison, only for a very short period, and you heard how he has been inside. He only slept in the prison like in a hotel, and during the day he sold aeroplanes to Russia, Mr. Krenz. And today, nobody of the responsibles for the East German communist system is in prison. And I think then we get a problem of justice. What feels the victims if they meet their interrogators on the street, and if they know that they reorganize themselves in big organizations. We have several organizations of former state security officers with more than 20,000 members, which held meetings and which are publishing different papers and which don't feel at all guilty for what they did. They said, we haven't been sentenced, so we cannot be guilty for any crime. It's one of the implications of these organizations. And so I think it was a big mistake not to organize how we can bring justice after the end of the communist system. The punishment of the responsibles were not even mentioned in the contract of unification between East and West Germany. A lot of things have been regulated in this contract. The wages of special employees of a special academy of building in East Germany, but the central topic, how to punish the responsible, haven't been mentioned in this contract of unification. And there wasn't any central organization, central prosecutor for making the prosecution of the responsibles. They said every country, every federal country organized the punishment of the responsibles for its own. And there wasn't a central office like it is existing towards the National Socialist crimes. So I think we made big mistakes after the end of communism. And another mistake I would like to mention was that we concentrated only towards the employees of the secret police. We didn't speak about the political responsibilities. And we didn't really organize some kind of punishment and of certification that they were responsible for crimes, for political crimes. They feel not guilty inside already. So I think the main reason is that the forces of, how can I say, of dealing with the past in a critical way, they have been very weak in Germany and also in the other countries, because the majority of people arrange with the system. And now, further the time has gone in Germany, the situation is like this, that people are forgetting the dark sides of communism, but they remember their own youth and their own positive memories, how they have been grown up in East Germany, and argumentating, it is my biography, and I don't want to make it bad, and especially if somebody in the western part of Germany comes and says, you lived in a dictatorship, I won't accept it. So I think we are in a difficult situation, and therefore it's very important to unify the weak forces, especially in the other Eastern European countries, as in Poland, as in Hungary, as in Czechoslovakia. And only if we unify these forces, perhaps we can reach a situation that really the majority of European countries, of European population, won't have any sympathy for communist systems in the future.
I have not done my job well because we have eaten into the next panel's time, and I'm very sorry for that, but I'm sure you'll agree that this was a very interesting session, and I think that we can look forward to more interesting sessions today. Thank you, panelists, and thank you.